Packet Pushers.
Hey everybody, welcome to Packet Protector, a new podcast at the intersection of security and networking from the Packet Pushers. I'm Jennifer J.J. Minella, and I'm here with Packet Pushers' own Drew Conry-Murray. And each week here, we discuss security topics, trends, and a couple of news headlines. Plus, we're going to be providing technical and strategic information that you can put to work. Some weeks, we talk with subject matter experts to get their perspectives and spice it up a little bit. So whether security is your full-time job or just one of your responsibilities, Packet Protector is for you. And in fact, we'd love to hear from you. If you have a topic request or burning question that you want answered, hop over to packetpushers.net/FU and send us a note. And Drew, I'm hoping the FU is for follow-up here.
It absolutely is. But if you're new to Packet Pushers, that should give you a sense of kind of the humor we run with. But yes, packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up, and we do love comments, clarifications, questions, whatever's on your mind, hit us up.
Awesome. So Drew, I know today we're diving into this kind of wild and wonderful world of secrets management for network engineers. And, kind of before we're getting into that, I did want to just level set with what we mean by secrets management here and maybe privileged access management. And so really in this context, what we kind of want to talk about is, the secret management as a practice that really allows privileged users to securely store sensitive data. And that's going to be in a secure way. And that we don't necessarily have specifics around what that is. But for network engineers, this might be passwords, SSH keys, API keys, and private certificate keys. So we're going to be talking about that, how to protect those credentials, and then a little bit about privileged access management, which really is not just a product. It encompasses sort of a suite of practices around protecting access for those admin users that have those privileged credentials.
Yeah, secrets management is frankly kind of a hornet's nest because you are dealing with the literal keys to the kingdom and you need to protect those keys, but people also need to have keys to the protection you're using to protect those keys. And it's kind of just this spiral of despair, frankly, but we'll get into it.
You just made that extra twisty. So let's talk about some of the maybe recent trends and news stories around this. And nothing specific from this week particular, but if we look over the past several months and even trends from the past 2, 3, 4 years, one of the interesting things is that credential theft, so theft of those different secrets we're talking about, has been the number one cause of data breaches.
Mm-hmm.
And those breaches, which were caused by stolen or compromised credentials, had an average cost of $4.5 million with an M, $1 million. So that this is not small potatoes, I guess.
Right. And if that's just an average, then there are numbers on either side of that that go lower or higher. So yeah, not surprised that these kind of breaches are happening and that they tend to be costly.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of fun numbers and things like the Verizon DBIR, which they put out each year. It's a fantastic resource. Some of the other numbers that we've seen from, of course, some of the numbers are maybe a little bit massaged because they're coming out of the vendors in the space. But even the third-party analysis here tells us things like, 3 and 4. So 75% of people are at risk because of poor password practices or poor secrets management practices.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the more recent issue we've seen just maybe popping up in the past 18 months or so, hitting prime time, is this hard-coded credential where developers, sysadmin, network admins, fill in the blank, are hard coding credentials into different scripts, scriptlets, and API calls. And so those numbers have been skyrocketing, and they're looking at, growth at like 50 and 60 and 70% year over year with how many publicly facing resources they're finding with these credentials that are hard coded in.
Yeah, that's scary. We hear about, the occasional vendor having a hard coded, lame password that's password 123 or whatever, maybe in the management plane. But if you're also doing it yourself, hard coding credentials inside your scripts, you might want to rethink that.
I'll be really interested. Maybe in the next few weeks we'll get somebody who actually does software development and has a history in that to come school us on what goes on in the hearts and minds of a developer at this point in time.
We probably need to have their voice anonymized or something, but yes, that would be interesting.
Sure, yeah. But anyway, there's just a long list of privileged access related breaches over the years. pages and pages from, consumer and retail organizations. Our U.S. Navy Special Warfare Group lost submarine communication codes to China through privileged access challenges here. And then kind of maybe pivoting a tiny bit and talking about the privileged access management, which is more of that broader suite of controlling what somebody can do with the credentials that we're securing somewhere. And we have a lot of different breaches that are by insiders. So, people who are authorized within the organization. And a lot of times that's just unintentional. So, the idea of privileged access management, where we're implementing this concept of least privilege, of really, we're only going to give you the access to what you need to do your job, and not any type of elevated privileges beyond that. And I'm guessing, like the parallel here in networking and Cisco is, you've got your different authorization levels as a, an admin, a network admin that you can implement. And, certainly as we get into like TACACs, and we can very tightly scope that, right?
Yeah, maybe I can go in and view configs, but not change them and so on. Maybe I can see what version of software it's running, but not update it, et cetera.
Yeah. But I think probably the most notable incident we had related to secrets management or password management in the past year or so was LastPass. So the LastPass breach, and I'm not trying to pick on LastPass, but it happened. So we're just going to use this as a case study and example. But, in that breach, it was a developer's personal home network and home computer through a Plex server that was compromised. And it was pretty tricky what they did. But ultimately, that developer was logging into a production environment using, sort of master keys to the kingdom and a level of access that only 4 people in the whole organization had.
Wow.
And, from a personal computer on a home network. So through a series of interesting, little micro attacks there, the attackers strung several vulnerabilities together. They were able to capture that and mimic that connection and steal the credentials from that home computer. And this played out over months. Right. So they were investigating the breach. They kind of trickled. I don't know if, how many of the different reports you read and coverage of this story, but it's been trickling data over the course of months for now, probably a year.
Right.
But then at the end of last year, what it seemed like was happening, because so the fast forward through all of this different investigation with the LastPass thing, what they were pretty sure at the end of it was that the production environment had been compromised, and that customers, so those of us that were using LastPass, our vaults had also been stolen, but they were still encrypted. And so then it was the question of, well, can they brute force these vaults?
Okay.
Or can they go, acquire, credentials that might be tied to an email address and just try, credential stuffing and brute force to figure out what those passwords are for the vaults. And what it looks like is happening is that the attackers were actually pretty smart and strategic here, that they did brute force some of the vaults specifically to get the seed data for cryptocurrencies. So they've been stealing cryptocurrency. And I think the last report I saw, this might be out of date at this point, but, it was like $35 million.
Wow.
Yeah. And that all just started from poorly protecting a password.
Yeah, and this is kind of what's frightening, because LastPass and other password management products are there to protect your passwords, protect these credentials so that you don't have to worry about it. But if they can't do that job, then what does that mean for the rest of us?
Yes. We're all just screwed.
Right.
But it kind of brings me to this idea that was it, I think somewhere in Spider-Man that said, like, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
And I'm looking at this going, okay, 4 developers had access to the passwords that were really truly the keys to their kingdom, and the keys to our kingdom as users of LastPass and customers of LastPass. Mm-hmm. But probably most of you guys listening, many network admins, sysadmins, developers have an absolutely ungodly amount of privileged access. I know over the years I've had levels of access, even in not just my own environments, but customer environments that I was helping, co-manage. Mm-hmm. That at this point in my, career in life, I would be scared to have that. I would just be scared you have that level of access because
Right.
it is a great responsibility, especially for protecting a customer.
Yep.
But I know we're all just trying to get our work done. We're all just trying to do things. There's people, barking at us. There's deadlines. There's this, there's that. And half the time we're just trying to figure out why something's not working. We get it working and we don't always make the most secure choices during a deployment. And we don't always document things well enough to go back and remind ourselves to revisit that and tighten it down. So, back to that passwords, SSH keys, API keys, creating certificates and the whole certificate signing request chain and the private keys associated with that. Probably all or most of us listening have these similar credentials and keys to the kingdom. And so I kind of thought it would be interesting to, talk through this with us and our audience to think through what do we need to be doing differently and what do we need to be thinking about as we're kind of navigating our day in our life now.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the central tension we're talking about here is that there are sensitive resources on the network inside the infrastructure. They have to be protected. There's a legitimate reason to protect them, but people also need to get their work done. And the more onerous you make getting that work done, the more workarounds people find, or they just decide to get lazy and stop following best practices because, as you said, somebody might be yelling at them because something's not working and it needs to get fixed right now. So it is a very difficult environment to kind of work in. So let's maybe talk about some approaches. One of them is sort of just basic secrets management. Yes.
Yes.
And essentially, that's what is secrets management?
Well, I think, this is that kind of class of solution or practice that allows those of us that are privileged users to securely store that. So again, and here's where I think things branch out and it gets a little bit confusing. And I'm confused. And so I know, Drew, we've talked about one of the reasons I'm excited about this podcast and this format is, I've been a network engineer and architect for over 20 years and doing security for well over 15 at this point. And I'm very confused and lost a lot of the time. So with 20 years of deep hands-on expertise here, I think if I have a lot of questions, probably a lot of people
also have questions.
Yes. Questions.
Yes.
But secrets management is everything from, password managers. So LastPass,
1Pass,
or
etc.
1Password. There's so many to other types of secrets. So I think, some of the examples I said were, with the passwords, we've got SSH keys,
right,
and API keys and tokens. And so, if you're a network engineer and you're logging into the various devices, whatever they are, switches, routers, firewalls, wireless controllers, or gateways, you probably a lot of us that have been doing this a long time that prefer the CLI, we probably have our various, telnet and SSH agents where we set it all up and we can quickly get to things, and certain things are pre-configured or saved in there for us. But a lot of times I think what happens is, and I'm curious if you've seen this too, is we do need easy, fast access, and we don't want to stop when we need to fix something or configure something or troubleshoot something and look up and figure out which IP address it is and then figure out what the credentials are to it and connect to some, proxy vaulted solution if the enterprise has that.
Right.
Try to get into it. We have our little quick list down the left and we click on it and it may even have pre-saved keys or credentials for us, right?
Yep. And you also may be able to work in some kind of multi-factor authentication, username, passphrase, et cetera, or a token, something that you actually have to have possession of to give you that extra layer of protection. But again, we've seen that itself is also not invulnerable. There are ways around that, or there are exploits that can, even if you've got multi-factor authentication, still lead to a loss or a breach or credential theft.
Absolutely. And I think that's, maybe we'll do a whole session on multi-factor with somebody because it's just fascinating to me. There's so many layers of that. And I mean, the LastPass breach, that workflow involved multi-factor. So there's certainly a lot of ways around it, from, SIM swapping to, just creating alert fatigue. If you've got the push notification in the app where you're just looking for a yes or a no, a lot of times an attacker can just like push, and the user's going to be like, what the hell's going on? And they finally just say, okay, fine, because they don't know what's in it. They don't know that there's a malicious user initiating that to them.
Right.
Hello, podcast listener. Did you know you can get even more nerdy podcast goodness? Check out Heavy Networking, a weekly conversation about routing, switching, WANs, LANs, data center networks, and more. Each episode features network engineers and industry experts going deep on existing technologies, as well as looking over the horizon to see what's coming next and how to get ready for it. We also offer insights and tips on professional development and career advancement. From access control to zero touch, from the CCNA to the CCIE, Heavy Networking is the podcast for network engineers. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
So I think one of the things that we should talk about is called privileged access management, or PAM, privileged access management, very quickly. Essentially what it does is it's monitoring access to sensitive or high-value devices and systems. And the idea is it's supposed to detect unauthorized access. It's supposed to flag anomalies. It should give you audit capability so that admins can see who has access to what and who's using what. And I guess PAM is kind of like a subset of your identity and access management infrastructure. It's not a replacement for it. It's supposed to bolt onto it and help you get an extra layer of visibility into what's actually happening with the credentials in use out there.
Yeah, exactly. And, there's a wild and wacky world just within the world of privileged access management and PAM solutions and workflows. But yeah, exactly. Typically, what I've seen, they plug into some type of an identity store, so AD or Intra ID or Okta, whatever you're going to be using. And so sometimes what I've seen is they're enterprise wide, but a lot of times what ends up happening is maybe a specific group or department initiates a PAM solution for their specific use case. And so what that could look like in an organization is, especially on networking, I'm going to kind of poke in a little bit more on that because, obviously that's my background and it's probably a lot of the listeners' backgrounds as well. And I think we do have some interesting requirements on the networking side because we are typically accessing things by CLI. We may need multiple levels or layers of access. And sometimes those things, if you put a PAM solution in and that's sort of a gatekeeper and you're going through the PAM gatekeeper, I'm going to regret saying this. You could kind of think of it as like a sort of, it has some common principles and overlap with how a VPN might work. And a big asterisk and caveat there, I'll clarify in a second. But you're getting to that thing. And then the PAM is controlling your access to what's beyond it.
Okay, so essentially, in some ways, like a proxy or a gateway that I have to pass through where a credential is stored. So I don't own that credential. It's the PAM, whatever jump server or whatever is providing that credential to my target device for me?
Sometimes, and I would say maybe ideally, yes. So sometimes it can broker the access. Broker the access and broker the credential. But other times it may just be more like a jump box type of setup. But it's a hop between you and whatever it is that you're accessing.
Okay.
And so sometimes it might just be the thing that authenticates you and then does the audit. I think audit, it's like the dirty 5-letter word for so many people. But like, if we just kind of think about it, if you're a network engineer person and you are, or any technical professional really, just kind of using that as a blanket statement, and you are accessing something or you're getting help accessing something. Let's say you've got a vendor that's helping you with the deployment or troubleshooting. Maybe there's somebody that's co-managing your environment, or maybe it's your vendor engineer that's offered to kind of hop in and help with something. I think that happens a lot. Or TAC. You have a TAC case open and they're like, okay, help me, either you do a remote desktop share with them. But sometimes I've certainly sat on TAC calls that were very, very, very long. And I can't afford to sit there and watch the engineer click around on my desktop for 4 hours trying to collect logs while I'm trying to freaking work.
Right.
So there's a play for using PAM for this type of thing. And, back to this idea that maybe there are different PAMs products in the environment because it could be, this group over here, let's say it's manufacturing or utilities, and they have a lot of operational technology in their environment to support that. It's like kind of OT type of stuff versus our traditional IT stuff.
Yep.
They may have a PAM solution to deal with those vendors. On the IT side, like I mentioned, those of us, that want that CLI type of access, we might want a different PAM solution because they're not all created equal. So they don't all do the same thing and they don't all do the same thing the same way.
Right. Yeah, they have different, there's cloud-based PAM, there's on-prem PAM, there's PAM you can get with your cloud infrastructure, there's PAM you can run on-prem, et cetera. I think, though, if you're thinking about investigating privileged access management, you want it to have a few basic capabilities. One is enforce least privilege. So it's not just, I'm going to broker a credential for you. It's also, I'm going to broker your access level, i.e., based on your role and your responsibilities. If you are a junior engineer, you get level A. If you are a senior engineer, you get level A and level B, and so on. So it provides that least privilege, which means you kind of reduce that attack surface. You reduce what an insider could do if they happen to be malicious, or if an outsider gets that credential, what they can do. The second thing is, again, minimizing insider threat, because IT does have the keys to the kingdom, literally. Servers, databases, switches, routers, firewall, security systems. Your own colleagues essentially are a risk. And so a PAM is supposed to help minimize that risk. And the third thing then is that assistance with audit and compliance. And that audit could be an internal audit. I just want to check every week who's doing what, who has access to what. It could be formal audits like some kind of client compliance framework. I know, in fact, the PCI DSS literally suggests that, yes, use a PAM. I think it's in section 722. So one of the good practices is having privileged access management in place. So regardless of how it's deployed, these are kind of the I think, table stakes features you want to look out for.
I think the good practice.
Right.
we know you're not going to do a best practice, but let's just get good practice.
Lowering the bar
all the day.
Someday we'll get to best practice. Let's start with good practice.
But yeah, and the audit word, again, I think this is kind of, a lot of us just cringe, but I'm hoping through the course of, our conversations and some of the topics and people we're going to be talking to here, that we can make that a little bit softer word for our technical audiences, because there is a place for us to participate in that, and we can really do a lot of good work and help an organization maintain its security posture through these different, audit and compliance requirements and our role that we play in that. And certainly, privileged access management, if it's done right, is an enabler, not another sticking point or a hurdle. But that's where it comes into, picking the right products. I've seen some that look pretty nightmarish to integrate on the back end, and they look relatively nightmarish if you are a network engineer who needs, rather unfettered, CLI access. And then there are some other ones. I'll throw out one name just because I think it's popular in the networking community, like Beyond Trust, that does a really interesting job in sort of catering to that more technical audience of, so if you imagine, take yourself out of the equation for a second, but if you did have a vendor coming in, or TAC or someone, and you could, give them the access that they need to help you without you letting them take over your entire desktop for the day, but you did have the control that you could, you could set it up different ways. So maybe it works, again, air quoting, you can't see me air quoting, sort of like a VPN, and that they can connect and initiate that whenever they want to. It could be that that they're going to be helping you, but you don't know exactly when. And so when a TAC engineer or a vendor or somebody hops in, or it could be even somebody from a different department in your own organization. So they're going to come in and try to help you. It kicks off a request for access that you would then approve. So, let's say Sally's my TAC engineer. Sally's going to be logging into this router she's helping me with troubleshoot. And I see an email that says, hey, Sally's trying to access this asset. I've already set up the permissions for her ahead of time. So I will just click, okay, go ahead. And then on the back end, also in the PAM solution, I can have those, dirty word audit controls on. And so what it will do is it could put a few guardrails in place and make sure, Sally TAC engineer doesn't accidentally do something like wipe my entire config or reboot or break something potentially that I don't want her to be doing without me getting a change management request and approval. But it can also record everything that happens. So some of these products get, deeply integrated into, that sort of CLI level of command structure where you can be very granular, and others of them don't. But typically all of them are going to have some recording capabilities. So whether it's PCI, the payment card, DSS requirements, or something else, or just your internal change management, you have now a recording and a log of what that person came in and did. And so you could scrub back and forth through it. So from a technical standpoint, I love that because it's it's a cover your ass from the security and compliance checkbox standpoint. But it's also great because if I don't know exactly what Sally did and I need to go back and maybe replicate whatever commands he or she was running, I have a tool to do that. So it kind of solves my documentation issue as well as that security checkbox.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with a little CYA, particularly around access management and these kind of controls. You want to have those logs because they could be the evidence you need to say, this wasn't my fault, if nothing else. A couple of the names that come to mind talking about PAM when I was researching for this episode, CyberArk came up a lot. They've been in the password vault space for a long time. They've got PAM options as well. And there's another company called StrongDM. They may be more aimed at the developer crowd, but they are doing privileged access management. And they've added a twist in that it's not just privileged access management. There's also a time value to it in that after a particular session or whatever ends, that credential gets revoked. So it's not a persistent credential that could be exploited. The Day 2 Cloud Show has done a couple of interviews with them if you're interested in checking out StrongDM and get more details on that.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I've not seen that one yet. I know like Delinea has been a big one, Manage Engine.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to.
You're not endorsing anybody here. We're just giving you names.
This is one of those where I think there's a space for everybody because CyberArk is very robust, but robust also means a little more complicated to integrate. It's got its target audience. The Beyond Trust is the Delineas of the world, focus a little bit differently. So lots of stuff out there. I think that would be a really cool maybe topic if people are interested. So packetpushers.net FU, let us know if you guys want to kind of hear some more along that lines. We could bring somebody in, kind of really dive into what that looks like on the back end and how that gets integrated.
Yeah, if you're regularly using a privileged access manager and you can talk about it, you don't have to say who you work for or whatever, but yeah, we'd love to maybe get you on the show and have a conversation. So reach out. You can also find us on LinkedIn if you're interested. I think one other thing to keep in mind is essentially, privileged access management is supposed to help you with your access challenges, but it also itself is going to have its own challenges. So I just want to kind of outline some that came to mind for me. One, I think, is keeping it updated. Users are changing their roles and responsibilities, which means their access requirements are going to change. So you want to make sure this system can keep up with however you're doing your roles and responsibilities, probably through some AD infrastructure, but just making sure that those two things stay in lockstep because you don't want to have these different roles and credentials based on incorrect information. The second thing is managing credentials and access to PAM itself. As we saw with LastPass, attackers will go after something like a LastPass because it's like a bank. That's where the money is. Your privileged access management system itself becomes a target because if you can compromise it, then you have access to everything. The next thing is, how onerous is it for IT employees particularly to use? Because we know that when access becomes onerous, folks will find workarounds. So getting too hardcore and locked down can actually, in some ways, be worse than maybe even, not no controls, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the first thing is roles and responsibilities. Who's responsible for watching this, for those alerts, for those anomalies? Who's investigating them? Who's doing the internal audits? Are those audits getting done? I assume there's probably going to be some kind of separation of duty for something like this because, again, when we're talking about, particularly thinking about internal risk, you want to make sure there's other eyes looking at this as opposed to the people you might be worried about.
Drew, that's a great point. I mean, the maturity of the organizations and the size of the organizations are just all over the place. And this is probably one of my soapbox items and points of frustration just in my professional life, which is that, yes, there are a lot of organizations I've worked with up to, large Fortune household names, and they tend to be very mature. They're highly regulated. They have very robust org charts in the operations side, the networking side, and the security side. But kind of the other 99.99 some percent of us are in organizations where and it's why I love this podcast, right? The intersection of security and networking or technical professionals is that there's not always a CISO and a whole organization around the CISO's office of analysts or even a SOC.
Yep.
The number of clients I've worked with over the years whose, their foray into security was, okay, we have hired or we are hiring somebody to look at the firewall logs. And I imagine at least one of you listening is laughing, but this is the reality that we're living in. And it's great because at least they're thinking about, okay, we need to be doing something. But looking at firewall logs, for anybody who's actually looked at firewall logs,
as a career, it sounds rough.
It's probably not going to move the needle or solve any problems. And you're probably going to have to get some mental health support for whoever's looking at the logs. So we don't always have these like mature organizations. And so this, roles and responsibilities things, I think you really just hit the nail on the head, because if we have triggers for different alerts and we've got logging and fill in the blank, somebody has to be consuming that, and somebody needs to be consuming that in a way that's scalable for a human. Again, looking at logs coming out of any piece of equipment or software is not going to cut it. And here's where, as we continue this conversation and this mission each week with this podcast, I think we have some opportunity here to figure out what do we do when we don't have, a security team and a SOC to dump these things to? What is our responsibility?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's important to kind of delineate those. And some organizations are a little more casual than others. And, your audit and compliance strategy can't be just, we let Sally do that. That's not a policy.
Yeah, Drew, there's just a lot to consider here with privileged access management. So let's wrap up, kind of circling back to secrets management for a quick second. Because I know we talked about what it was. We didn't dive too much into what the action item was related to that. So I'm curious on your thoughts, but I guess mine related to this are, secrets management, whether it's a password manager, SSH keys, API keys, et cetera, fill in the blank, that we just need to be aware and have that sort of knowledge that we do have these secrets, be hyper aware, even if it's not a straight username and password, that, SSH keys and API keys are just as vulnerable and just as important to protect as something like a root or an admin password and credential set. So, my kind of thoughts on this are, let's pay more attention to these different keys and tokens that we have that need some special love. My hope is that the organization that you work with, at least for your day job, has something that is enterprise-wide for them, that they have vetted, and that they make it easy for you to use and integrate, whether it's on your computer, your phone, et cetera, and that you're able to take advantage of that for at least your work purposes. And then if you're using them for personal, there's so many out there that are either free or very well priced. And a lot of the business ones actually offer like free home use for their employee users. So that's definitely something to ask about. And then I think, Drew, what I'm thinking here is, make sure that two things, make sure that the secrets manager you're using is appropriate for the secrets. So again, a password manager works great with passwords. It may not be really set up to protect something like an SSH key or an API key. I mean, you can throw a string in there somewhere and do it as a secured note. And then the last piece there is whatever you're using, it's probably going to have areas for notes and unencrypted text, as well as, the encrypted vaulted pieces of those entries, and just make sure you are using each of those appropriately.
Do you mean notes in terms of like some documentation and some context, or notes that contain sensitive information?
Yeah, well, both, because so sometimes I think sometimes there's a notes field. LastPass has a notes field, Keeper has notes fields, things like that. And each of those different credential managers handles that differently. So in some of them, all of it is vaulted and encrypted. And in others, maybe the password field is encrypted, but not the username and not the notes. I'm just throwing that out as an example. So if you have like, my old password was this, because I don't know how many of you guys have done this, but it's like sometimes the systems don't sync on the back end, and some of the crap that you're logging into is federated with something else, and the thing hasn't synced, and you need your old password and your new password.
Got it. Okay.
Or recovery codes. So that's kind of popular now is, you have these recovery codes that an application might spit out at you, and they say, save these in case you get locked out of your account and you don't have your password, multi-factor, whatever. You can use these very long strings. Microsoft was one of the early adopters of this. They had, application keys. So very long strings of letters and numbers that aren't going to go into the password field. That's not your password. So they end up usually getting stuck into notes. If they're in a vault where the note is not encrypted, then that's definitely a vulnerability for you.
Yeah. So I guess my takeaways are, if secrets management is something that you have to tackle, good luck. You have our sympathies. It's a tough gig. And my second one is, if you hadn't considered API keys, I really hadn't thought about it until you mentioned them. That's probably a very smart thing to be thinking about getting your arms around in terms of secrets management, because more and more systems, including networking systems, are using APIs to connect, to share data, to trade data, to extract information from. They are, definitely something that you should be thinking about approaching systematically. So if API keys weren't on your list before, they should be.
Yeah. And Drew, I'm not a coder. I'm going to tell on myself here. I quit coding at QBasic a very long time ago because I'm just that bad at it. So I did do, Juniper Networks and their Mist stuff had some free, like learn Python scripting to do some stuff because the Juniper Mist ecosystem is configured by API. So you don't have CLI and you don't have SNMP. You can use the web interface or you can interact with it through API scripts. So I thought that was cool and I wanted to understand that. And, I did all the little training, and I did it in a demo environment, basically, right? It was not a production environment. But, if you're starting to play with things like that, regardless of the vendor, fill in the blank, right? Definitely you're going to want to treat those API keys just like you would a root password.
All right, well, that wraps up this episode. I think this is a topic we will probably be coming back to in many forms as we run this podcast forward. But in the meantime, thank you for listening. And just a reminder, if you're interested, you can connect with JJ and me and everybody else at the Packet Pushers crew directly via our Slack channel. We operate it for Packet Pushers listeners. It's free to sign up. You can tap into a vibrant community of infrastructure and security professionals, or just come for the memes. You can check it out at packetpushers.net/Slack. As always, thanks for listening.